Zartok was one of the finest assassins in the galaxy. His reputation preceded him in every corner of the universe, a shadow among shadows moving unseen through the darkest corners of every world. His enemies never stood a chance when his name was whispered in fear. No one ever thought to question his abilities. He was the embodiment of death itself, each mission executed with flawless precision and swift finality. But today, as he arrived on the distant world of Tovrak, the sense of familiarity he usually felt on such missions was missing. The air seemed thicker than usual. The planet's capital was alive with sound and light, but there was a tension in the atmosphere that Zartok couldn't shake. It was almost as if the city itself was holding its breath. His target was a human diplomat tasked with negotiating an alliance between two rival factions on the brink of war. The political weight of the mission was immense, and the stakes even higher. Zartok was well aware of the importance of this human's survival, or rather the necessity of their death. But as he moved through the bustling streets and slipped into the dimly lit hotel where the diplomat was staying, something felt strange. He had done this countless times, tracked his prey into their dens of luxury and death alike. But this time it was different. The usual hum of anticipation that buzzed in his mind as he prepared for a kill was absent. It was replaced by a subtle feeling of unease. Zartok entered the diplomat's room using his stealth tech to glide past the security measures in place and to bypass the guards with ease. The room was quiet, too quiet for a space meant to host a human of such rank. He scanned the area for any sign of the diplomat, but found none. No movement, no heat signature from his thermal sensors, no sign of life whatsoever. It was as if the human had simply vanished. Yet the room showed no sign of disturbance. There were no broken locks, no force fields breached. Everything was in place as it should be. Zartok's fingers moved to the communicator built into his wrist. His mind was already forming excuses that he might have to give his superiors when he failed, but something stopped him as he began to speak. His thoughts froze. An electric tingle ran down his spine, and a gut feeling seized him. It was as if someone was watching him. His trained instincts told him to leave the room, to reconsider the mission, but he couldn't shake the odd sense that he was being observed. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning every corner of the room for something, anything that might explain the unnatural stillness, and yet he found nothing. The room seemed perfect in every way, but the feeling in the air was not. And that was when it happened. A sound like a whisper, a tiny breath of air that moved past his ear, so faint that even his enhanced hearing would have missed it if he had not been so attuned to the atmosphere around him. In that moment, Zartok realized something was wrong in a way he had never encountered before. Humans were meant to be predictable. They were fragile creatures caught between the extremes of the galaxy's inhabitants. But this human diplomat was not behaving in any way Zartok had anticipated. The feeling deepened. It was as though the air itself was conspiring against him. The shadows stretched unnaturally long in the corners of the room, and the assassin's mind began to race. Perhaps it wasn't a simple fluke. Perhaps this human had something beyond the usual tricks of prey. Perhaps this was a mystery far more complex than he had ever known. Zartok stood still in the diplomat's room, his mind racing, trying to process what had just occurred. The sensation of being watched lingered like an echo in the air, but there was nothing to see, no one to confront. The feeling gnawed at him, making his enhanced senses feel almost useless. He could still feel the faint hum of his cloaking device as it blended with the walls, and the cool surface of his weapon pressed against his side, but none of it seemed to matter now. His target was gone, and in its place was an unsettling emptiness, something that didn't belong to any of his prior experiences with prey. He reactivated his communicator and called his superior. An authoritative voice crackled through the static, demanding a report. Zartok hesitated for a moment before responding with a tone that carried more uncertainty than he intended. "I couldn't locate the target," he admitted. "The human diplomat has disappeared without a trace. I've searched the area thoroughly, but there's no sign of struggle, no evidence of escape." His superior's voice grew cold, dismissing his report with a few curt words. A failure was not acceptable. Not in the slightest. Zartok was told to continue his mission, and not to return until the diplomat was eliminated by any means necessary. The words stung, though he didn't show it. His pride was on the line. but there was more at stake than that. This human had managed to evade him in a way that shouldn't have been possible, and that bothered him more than he cared to admit. Jartok left the room and moved through the corridors of the hotel with deliberate steps, his eyes scanning every inch of the space around him. But the unsettling feeling of being watched didn't dissipate. It only grew stronger the further he moved. The whole city seemed to close in on him, with every turn he took, as if the very environment was conspiring to make him feel like an intruder. And then it struck him, humans were known for their unpredictability, but this level of evasion was beyond anything he had ever encountered before. He had to admit that the diplomat's disappearance was no coincidence. Determined to learn more, Jartok went back to the databanks. The galaxy-wide archives were filled with stories of ancient species and their unique qualities, but it was in the rare and often dismissed sections that Jartok found the most interesting information. Ancient texts spoke of humans in a way few remembered. They were referred to as a species with an innate ability to evade capture, a species that could disappear without a trace without the aid of technology. It was an old myth, but it resonated with Jartok more than he cared to acknowledge. Humans weren't just vulnerable prey. They were something else entirely. They were elusive and cunning in a way that could not be explained by mere physical limitations. The assassin dug deeper into the archives, searching for any clue that might explain what he had just witnessed. There was mention of the human race's evolutionary history and their ability to adapt to any environment. But that was nothing new to him. Every species adapted in one way or another, but what caught his attention was a particular detail that described the human instinct for survival as something beyond the norm. They had an innate sense of danger, a sixth sense that allowed them to perceive threats before they even materialized. Jartok felt a cold shiver run down his spine as the implications of that hit him. These humans were not just physically elusive, they were mentally and instinctively unpredictable. His eyes narrowed as he processed the new information. Suddenly, the challenge was more complicated than just eliminating a diplomat. It was about understanding an opponent who didn't follow the rules. Jartok had been trained to follow the patterns of his enemies, to anticipate their moves. But humans were something else. They defied patterns. They were wild in the most dangerous sense of the word. And Jartok knew one thing for certain now. He wasn't just hunting a target, he was hunting a mystery that would require far more than the usual tactics to unravel, and that was exactly what made him realize he had underestimated his prey. Jartok spent hours in the archives, his mind consumed by the new revelations about humans. The more he dug, the more he realized how little he knew about the species, despite their presence in every corner of the galaxy, and the countless times he had encountered them in various missions. He had always considered them weak, fragile creatures that could be hunted with ease, but now he saw them in a different light. They were not merely prey, they were an enigma, and the deeper he delved into the archives, the clearer it became that this puzzle had been hidden for a reason. The records were scattered fragments of ancient lore, many from eras long forgotten by the other species, some so old they had been relegated to myth. Jartok uncovered one such myth that described the early humans as wanderers who traveled the galaxy long before the rise of the intergalactic empires. Their ability to slip through the fingers of predators was legendary. But it was more than just their physical adaptability that allowed them to evade capture. The myth spoke of an innate connection to the environment, something deeper than any technology or technique. It was as if humans were in tune with the very fabric of life itself, their survival instincts far beyond those of any known species. The more he read, the more he realized the truth of the stories. They spoke of humans as a species with an extraordinary ability to read their surroundings with an awareness that transcended logic and prediction. Their natural instincts allowed them to sense the presence of danger before it arrived. They could feel the subtle shifts in the air, the slight tremors in the ground, the faintest hints of a threat before it materialized. Jartok's mind struggled to comprehend this idea. For an assassin like him, everything was about precision, calculation, and foresight. Every movement, every plan was a reflection of the information available to him. But humans didn't operate on information, they operated on something far more primal. One story in particular caught his attention. It was about a human who had evaded an entire army using nothing more than his awareness of the world around him. The army had set traps, ambushed him, and sent their best trackers after him. But he never once fell into their grasp. The human was able to sense the smallest changes in the wind, feel the vibrations of footsteps long before they could get close enough to strike. It was said that the human could even hear the heartbeat of his pursuers from miles away. And it wasn't just a gift of heightened senses, it was an intrinsic understanding of how the universe operated, how every piece of the world fit together in a way that allowed the human to remain elusive. Chartok was fascinated, but also frustrated as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Humans didn't follow the rules of hunting, they didn't play by the same logic as the other species in the galaxy. They had evolved into something entirely different, a force of nature in their own right, and Chartok couldn't quite grasp it. How could they be so attuned to the world around them that they could predict his every move? It wasn't just skill or intuition, it was something else, something deeper. As he closed the archives and sat back to process the knowledge he had uncovered, a single thought began to form in his mind. Humans were not just difficult to kill, they were designed to survive in ways no other species had ever been prepared for. Their instincts were a weapon in themselves, and Chartok realized that this mission would be unlike any other he had undertaken. It wasn't just about finding a target, it was about confronting an entire way of existence that he had never encountered before. And if he was going to succeed, he would have to do something he had never done before, adapt in ways that defied everything he knew about being an assassin. The following days were a blur of reconnaissance, planning, and frustration. Chartok had never felt so out of his element. Each time he tracked a human target, each time he moved in for the kill, the sense of failure grew heavier. No matter how intricate his plans were, no matter how many tactics he employed, he couldn't catch them. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched. It was the unsettling realization that these humans knew his every move before he even made it. They weren't just reacting. They were predicting. The more Chartok thought about it, the more it dawned on him that this wasn't just a challenge. This was a game where the rules had shifted, and he was the one being hunted. Chartok decided to take a more direct approach. He had to understand his enemy in a way that went beyond his usual methods. No more relying on gadgets, no more using stealth to outsmart his targets. The humans he pursued were different. They were capable of sensing things he couldn't. A strange, inexplicable ability to feel the world around them on a level beyond mere perception. He needed to know how they did it, how they survived against creatures and forces far more powerful than themselves. So Chartok set out to confront this new challenge head-on. He tracked a group of human rebels on a remote planet in the far reaches of the galaxy. These rebels were causing widespread disruption, sabotaging the operations of the powerful corporations that had long dominated the sector. Chartok was ordered to eliminate them. But this time, he didn't approach them with his usual caution. Instead, he made himself known, moving through the wilderness, intentionally leaving traces for them to find. It was a challenge, a test of both his skill and his assumptions. As he moved deeper into their territory, Chartok couldn't shake the feeling that he was being observed. His heightened senses told him nothing was wrong, yet every step he took seemed to echo louder than it should. It was as if the land itself was listening to him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He tried to brush it off, but the feeling of being followed grew stronger. And then, just as he had anticipated, they struck. A flash of motion, a snap of branches, and suddenly he was surrounded. The rebels hadn't ambushed him from behind. They were already in front of him, standing on the high ground, watching him from a distance. The leader, a human female with wild hair and a piercing gaze, stepped forward. "You're predictable," she said, her voice calm but laced with something dangerous. "You're not like us. You don't understand the game." Chartok tightened his grip on his weapon, but he didn't move. This wasn't the kind of confrontation he was used to. They weren't afraid. They weren't running. The rebels didn't show signs of panic. They stood there, still as statues, watching him, knowing he couldn't act without consequences. The realization hit him like a cold wave. They had known he would come. They had anticipated every move. In that moment, Chartok understood. Humans didn't just react, they adapted to everything. The land, the air, the wind, they could sense the tiniest shifts, the slightest disturbance, long before it reached anyone else. Their awareness was not just physical, it was something far more profound. They didn't need gadgets or tracking devices. They didn't rely on tech to guide them. They were in tune with something deeper, something primal, that no one else seemed to understand. Zartok was faced with an uncomfortable truth. To defeat the humans, he would have to change everything he knew about combat, strategy, and survival. The usual rules didn't apply. The humans weren't merely outsmarting him. They were playing a different game altogether. And if he was going to defeat them, he would need to step into a world he had never known. A world where every instinct, every decision, had to be made without the tools he had come to rely on. The rules were gone, and Zartok was left scrambling to catch up. As the rebels melted back into the shadows, leaving him standing alone in the wilderness, he knew his mission had just become infinitely more complex. It was no longer just about hunting them down. It was about learning how to see the world through their eyes, and in doing so, discovering the key to defeating them. The challenge had shifted, and Zartok had never been so intrigued. Zartok's training had always been a careful blend of patience and precision. He was a master of stealth, a shadow in the dark. But now, as he stepped into the dense forests of the rebel planet once again, there was no shadow to hide in, no quiet corner to lurk unnoticed. This time, Zartok wasn't just tracking his prey. He was trying to think like them, to feel the world around him the way they did. He had spent days practicing the subtle art of awareness, training his senses to become attuned to the smallest fluctuations in the air, the shifts in the earth beneath his feet, the way the wind seemed to carry whispers of movement. He had spent hours meditating, focusing his mind to let go of his instincts of calculation, of strategic planning, and to embrace something more fluid, more unpredictable. But this was his first true test, and he wasn't sure yet if he was ready. The human rebels were clever. They had already learned to sense his approach. Zartok could feel it as he entered their territory again. The atmosphere seemed thick with anticipation, as though the very land itself was aware of his presence. The rebels were far from easy prey. Their leader, the one who had taunted him, had eyes that seemed to pierce the veil of his every action. Zartok had learned that she was always one step ahead, always prepared, and it was clear now that she had trained her people in the same manner. They were not running or hiding. They were waiting, watching, ready to move as soon as they sensed the slightest disturbance. Zartok, however, was no longer relying on his traditional methods. He no longer tried to mask his movements completely, no longer hid in the shadows. Instead, he allowed the rebels to hear him, to know he was near. He walked openly through their land, leaving subtle signs of his passing. He didn't know exactly what he was trying to prove to them or to himself, but he was testing something, testing whether he could feel the same invisible threads of awareness they used to track him. Every footstep, every movement was now part of the game, part of the strategy. As he continued deeper into the forest, Zartok sensed the change in the air. The tension had shifted. He wasn't the only one moving through the trees anymore. There was a ripple, a vibration, that he could no longer ignore. The rebels were closing in, moving swiftly through the underbrush, adapting to his every step. He could hear their soft footfalls, almost imperceptible, but they were there. They were getting closer. Suddenly, a figure leaped from the shadows, coming down from a low branch. It was one of the rebels, a male with dark hair and a silent demeanor. Zartok barely had time to react as the man lunged at him, but he didn't fight back. Instead, he let the man get close, feeling the shift in the air as the rebels' movements became more predictable. At the last moment, Zartok sidestepped, narrowly avoiding the strike, and the rebel passed by him, his momentum carrying him forward. Zartok didn't strike. He didn't need to. He could feel the rebels' movements before they happened, the slightest tension in his muscles, the subtle shifts of his weight. It was the same way the humans had evaded him before. The rebel quickly recovered, but Jartok wasn't interested in confrontation. This wasn't about a fight. It was about understanding. The moment the rebel realized he had been outmaneuvered, he paused, confusion flickering across his face. Jartok spoke, his voice low and calm. "You know what's coming before it happens, don't you?" The rebel didn't answer, but his eyes flickered with recognition. Jartok wasn't just hunting the rebels anymore. He was beginning to understand them. They didn't just rely on physical strength or tech to survive. They relied on something deeper, something instinctual. It wasn't enough to just be fast or strong. The humans saw the world as it was, fluid, alive, and interconnected. They felt the changes in their environment, anticipated movements before they were even made. As Jartok moved forward, he felt a shift within himself. He was no longer the predator in this environment, hunting his prey from the shadows. He was becoming a part of the world around him, learning to listen to the same signals the humans followed. The rules of the game had changed. And now, Jartok knew, in order to truly understand his prey, he had to stop thinking like an assassin and start thinking like a human. Jartok had never been one for patience. He was a predator, a creature of efficiency and decisive action. Yet, as he trekked deeper into the wild terrain, the understanding he sought was slowly taking root, much like a seed buried deep in the earth. He had spent years perfecting his ability to hunt, but now he found himself having to relearn the most fundamental aspects of survival. It wasn't about weapons or technology anymore. It wasn't about being faster or stronger. It was about being present, about feeling the pulse of the world around him in a way he never had before. The human rebels were still following him, not in the way they had before. No longer did they try to trap him or attack him from the shadows. Instead, they seemed to be observing him, like students watching a teacher. And Jartok understood now that they weren't just studying his actions. They were waiting for him to embrace the game they had mastered. They were waiting for him to stop thinking like an assassin and to start thinking like them. They were waiting for him to stop being a hunter and to become something else. For days, Jartok allowed himself to become more attuned to the natural world around him. Every sound, every movement, every gust of wind became a clue, a part of the puzzle that the humans had already solved. He learned to listen, not with his ears, but with his entire being. He began to feel the way the world shifted, as though the trees themselves whispered their secrets to him. The rebel leader's words echoed in his mind. "You're predictable." Now, Jartok understood what she had meant. It wasn't that he couldn't anticipate their moves. It was that he had been thinking in straight lines, whereas the humans thought in circles, in waves. They saw the ebb and flow of everything, not just the immediate path. He found himself standing on the edge of a cliff, the vast expanse of wilderness stretching out before him. It was beautiful in its own raw, untamed way. Jartok had never taken the time to appreciate the sights and sounds of a place before. It was always about the mission, about the target. But now, as the cool wind swept through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine, he felt a deep sense of awareness wash over him. The world was alive in a way he had never noticed before. He could feel the pulse of life in everything, the rustling leaves, the distant chirping of birds, the faint trembling of the earth beneath him. It was all connected. It was all part of the same rhythm. And then it happened. In the distance, he spotted a shadow moving through the trees. It was a figure, human, of course, but this one was different. It wasn't just a soldier or a rebel. It was the human leader, the one who had taunted him and challenged him. Jartok's instincts kicked in, but this time, he didn't rush. He didn't react immediately. Instead, he stayed still, watching. And as the leader's presence grew stronger in his senses, Jartok finally understood. He could feel her, as if the very earth beneath him was guiding him to her. The pulse of the land, the flow of the environment, it all pointed toward her. He stepped forward, moving with the same fluid grace that the rebels had mastered. He wasn't hunting anymore. He was tracking, yes, but this was different. The roles had shifted, and he could feel it in the way his body moved, the way his thoughts aligned with the world around him. He was becoming part of the natural rhythm. He was becoming part of the game. The rebel leader turned, and for a moment, their eyes met. There was no fear in her gaze, no challenge, just a quiet understanding. Zartok had crossed the threshold. He wasn't just playing their game anymore. He was starting to understand it. She stepped closer, her voice carrying on the wind. "You're getting closer," she said, her words as calm and measured as ever. But the real game is only just beginning. Zartok felt a surge of something within him. A new awareness, a new hunger. The game had indeed changed, but now, it was a game he was ready to play. It was no longer about defeating his opponents. It was about becoming one with them, understanding them on a level that went beyond the physical, beyond the tactical. It was about seeing the world through their eyes, and, in doing so, finding the way to outsmart them. For the first time, Zartok wasn't just chasing a target. He was part of something much larger, something far more profound, and he was ready to take the next step. Zartok sat in the stillness of the forest, the quiet broken only by the sounds of distant wildlife. His mind, however, was far from peaceful. His encounter with the human rebels had shaken him to his core. For the first time in his career, the predator had become the prey, and the strange, unsettling realization gnawed at him. These humans were not just elusive, they were something else entirely, something he could not yet grasp. The fact that they knew his every move before he made it was a puzzle he could not solve, and every instinct he had told him he had to adapt, quickly. The mission was clear. Zartok had to eliminate the human resistance group before they could rally more support, but now, the tactics he had relied on for centuries seemed meaningless. He had always been the one who controlled the hunt, the one who anticipated his target's every move. Now he was the one being outmaneuvered, and the truth was unsettling. His greatest skill was no longer enough. Zartok's thoughts turned to the human leader, the one who had spoken to him in the wilderness, her calm voice seeping into his mind. Her words still rang in his ears, cutting through the haze of his frustration. "You're predictable," she had said. "You don't understand the game." At the time, it had felt like a taunt, but now Zartok recognized it for what it was. A challenge. She hadn't been mocking him. She had been offering a glimpse into their world, a world where nothing was static, where everything was fluid and ever-changing. A world where the rules of hunting didn't exist because the prey wasn't confined to the same boundaries. He couldn't continue using his old methods. To do so would be to accept failure. He needed to understand this different kind of game, and for that, he needed more than just his weapons and tactics. Zartok had always relied on his superior training, his sophisticated technology, and his ability to think several steps ahead. But these humans didn't play by the same rules. They relied on something else, something that felt almost instinctual. They saw the world differently, and in order to defeat them, Zartok realized he needed to see it through their eyes. The realization hit him like a jolt of energy. The human leader had said it herself. This was a game, but not one of calculation and cold precision. It was a game of instincts, a game of feeling. And to truly understand it, Zartok had to stop thinking like an assassin and start thinking like them. He needed to shed his reliance on technology and embrace something more primal. But how could he begin to shift his mindset when everything he knew told him to be methodical, to outwit his opponents with logic? The answer didn't come all at once. It was slow, a shift in perspective that took root in the quiet of the forest, in the moments when he stopped to listen to the world around him. He began to pay attention to the subtle shifts in the environment, the way the wind rustled the leaves, the way the birds seemed to react to every movement he made, the smallest disturbances, the things that might have been invisible to others. Zartok started to see how the humans might be sensing the world, how they might be anticipating his every move. He practiced, not with weapons, not with stealth, but with his senses. He tuned into the rhythm of the world, the pulses in the ground, the way the air moved. Slowly, he began to understand. Humans were attuned to the universe in a way no other species was. Their survival was not just about avoiding death. It was about being one with the world around them, predicting and reacting before danger even arrived. Zartok knew the time had come to confront the human leader again. This time, he wouldn't rely on technology. This time, he would step into the unknown, armed only with the instincts he had worked so hard to cultivate. He would enter the game, not as a hunter, but as something else entirely. And maybe, just maybe, he would be able to finally outplay his prey. The next move was his. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain as Zartok moved quietly through the dense underbrush. The air was thick with tension. Every step he took was measured, calculated, but there was something different now. His previous arrogance had been replaced by a deep, unsettling awareness. The world around him felt alive, as if every rock, every leaf, every gust of wind held a secret. And the humans, the ones he had been hunting, had been right all along. It wasn't just about being faster or stronger. It wasn't about using advanced technology or flawless precision. It was about feeling the world, sensing it on a deeper level than he ever had before. Zartok had spent days learning to blend in with the land, to move without making a sound, to anticipate the movements of the rebel group before they made them. He had spent nights meditating, trying to quiet his mind, trying to understand how the humans could so easily sense danger before it even appeared. He had stopped thinking like a predator and started thinking like them, like the prey. And now he had finally reached the moment of truth. Ahead, he spotted the human leader, standing at the edge of a clearing. Her back was to him, her eyes scanning the horizon. She seemed to note he was there, as if she had felt his presence long before he stepped into the open. Zartok could feel her awareness, the same intuitive sense of danger that had once eluded him. She was waiting for him, but it wasn't a challenge. It was a recognition, a mutual understanding that the hunt was over. This wasn't about victory or defeat. It was about something far greater. Zartok stepped into the clearing, moving slowly, deliberately. The human leader turned, her gaze meeting his. Her expression was unreadable, but there was no fear in her eyes, only curiosity. And in that moment, Zartok understood. The game had never been about the kill. It had always been about the knowledge, the experience, the connection between them. She had known this from the start. She had seen the predator in him and had patiently waited for him to see the world the way she did. "You're here," she said, her voice calm, almost amused. "I thought you might get here eventually." Zartok didn't answer at first. He was still processing the enormity of the revelation. The humans hadn't just been hiding from him. They had been guiding him, pushing him to adapt, to change, to understand. They had never been the prey. They had been the teachers, and he had been the student all along. "I didn't expect this," Zartok finally said, his voice low. "I thought I could outsmart you, kill you, like I always do." The human leader nodded slowly. "You did what you knew, but you've learned. You've changed." She stepped closer to him, her eyes never leaving his. "You're not the hunter anymore. You're part of this world now." Zartok stood still, contemplating her words. The weight of his old identity, the assassin, the hunter, the one who always controlled the outcome, began to slip away. What he had thought was a simple mission had transformed into something far more profound. He had been chasing something, but he had never understood what that something was until now. It wasn't just about survival. It wasn't about domination. It was about understanding, about seeing the world with a different perspective, a different set of eyes. The human leader extended a hand toward him, a gesture of peace, not of conquest. Zartok looked at her hand, then at the world around him. The forest, the hills, the sky above. It all seemed so much more alive than it ever had before. And in that moment, he realized something else. The true power wasn't in the ability to kill. It wasn't in strength or speed or cunning. It was in the ability to connect, to feel the world and everything in it, to sense the flow of life and understand its rhythms. Zartok slowly reached out, taking her hand. There was no resistance, no fight. In that instant, the predator and the prey, the hunter and the hunted, were no longer separate. They were both part of the same game. "I see now," Zartok said softly. "It was never about winning. It was about understanding." The human leader smiled. "Exactly." And with that, the game was over. But the journey had only just begun.